childhood through mid-adolescence. So really thinking, I'm not exactly sure what this camera is.
Sorry, there are some students, I forgot, there are some students who are not able to come here, so they watch it after on YouTube.
Wow.
Sorry.
Wow.
Yeah. I set up a private channel. It's a private YouTube channel. It's online. No. It's okay. Sorry.
Sorry, a little diversion.
They get you some good lighting. Sorry. You're good. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do the pose.
Skinny arms.
Exactly.
We're also very fun here. No.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun.
So, as I was saying, so my primary interests are caregiver relationships and how they influence children's achievement trajectories. Pretty much through, early school entry to, say, entering into high school. And I use, I'm a quantitative researcher, so I use quantitative methods to get at those questions. I've primarily used the National Institutes of Child Health and Development database, which is a study of 1,364 children from birth through they're now in college. My graduate school advisor was a principal investigator on the study. Are you all familiar with sort of what those sorts of things mean, like principal investigator on a study? Okay, so if you apply for a grant and you are sort of the primary person leading that grant and sort of deciding what the research questions are, where the funds go, you're called the principal investigator. So she was the one of the 13 principal investigators. This was a really large-scale study on this grant. So I got used of all the data, which is sort of something to think about as you move forward in your careers. If you ever decide to go back to grad school, it's a big decision of who you work with, which I probably would agree with, because I've really been able to get involved in that study and almost sort of build my career up to date on that study. Because I'm really interested in thinking about different quantitative methods and how these methods can allow you to make what I call causal, or what people call causal inference. So quantitative work, you're just looking at whether two things correlate to one another, right? So if having a better quality relationship with your teacher relates to achievement, but what are some flaws with that? Like why can't you say relationships cause achievement trajectories, or cause kids to do?
You can't really measure a relationship.
That's a good point. We try to with a teacher report, but you're right. There's a lot of other variables that go into that, and then through qualitative research, you can really get more in-depth analysis. Well, there are issues like one, what direction it goes, right? So maybe kids who do better in school have better relationships because they're easier to deal with. Right? You're a teacher, and you're being evaluated on how kids do in your classroom. Kids who just naturally tend to do better, you might like better. Mm-hmm. They're quote unquote easier. That's a perception, like you're saying, like that sort of bias. Right? And there can be a slew of other factors that are related to both achievement and relationship quality. So it can be, girls tend to do better in school, and they tend to have better relationships with their teachers. So you can say that these two things correlate to one another, but you can't say one causes the other. But there are sort of all these new statistical techniques that are trying to get at causality by taking into account all these other factors. So I'm very interested in those sort of techniques, and I've been able to play around with that with this large data set. So both qualitative and quantitative methods can answer the questions I'm interested in. I've just gone down the quantitative route, partly because of my training, partly because I like numbers. That's sort of where I am. I'm really interested in the classroom context in particular, as it influences now the camera can be on you.
Get ready. So, I'm Mir Domingo. I've been here for, I guess this is my second year here. I'm a visiting assistant professor, but I also did my doctoral studies here and my master's studies, so I've been here for a while too.
Come to think of it.
Yeah, it's been 6, 7, yeah. And actually the way I came to my question, it really started before I arrived here. I used to teach middle school, I'll know the story, the class, but I used to teach middle school kids, and it was in New Jersey, a public school, and one of my prerequisites when I was searching for a job was that I really wanted to work in a diverse school environment, and I did that for 5 years, and every year, I kept working to try to make sure the kids that seem, unengaged or were at risk, oftentimes there are kids who are, multilingual, socioeconomically, like their lives at home is not as stable. And I found I couldn't seem to reach those kids. I couldn't get them to be interested in the academic content, even though, my relationship with them was great and they liked coming to my class. But it really bothered me. I felt like as a teacher, I wasn't doing my job. So I went back for my master's, and that helped somewhat. I even switched from an English major to English ed, but even then, there still seemed to be an issue where I just couldn't reach them, no matter what kind of tools and tricks I tried. So that really made me decide to go back for my doctoral studies, and I realized, okay, I'm trying to help them, and I'm looking at it from the academic setting through the perspective of, schools, teachers, but I've never seen it through the kids' perspective. So that's why when I came here, I knew I was interested in studying literacy, right, reading and writing, but I knew I wanted to study it in an out-of-school context. I also, in the 5 years I was teaching, started to see that when I used technology, it seemed to reach the kids in a different way. And things started to happen that I wasn't planning for, but there's an authentic learning environment that was starting to evolve. So I knew I wanted to study kids in out-of-school contexts, their reading and writing, and preferably if they use technology. And then also I knew I wanted to work with a specific population. It's those kids who I couldn't reach in the classroom. So when I started my doctoral studies, I did a study abroad in London. And part of the study abroad would involve a mini ethnography. We would have to look at a community, right? And I decided, hey, why don't I give this a shot? Let me reach out to, community centers, like Filipino community centers. So my background is Filipino, and I didn't know as much about that population, but it's the second largest immigrant population, so I thought, okay, this is my chance to study perhaps in that context as well. So when I did, that's where I was introduced to my key informant, who later introduced me to who would become my participants. And when I met them, I guess as an ethnographic researcher, a part of me just felt like there's this intuition that told me this is the group. And when I spoke to them, I could tell it's not going to be easy for them to let me in because they're adolescent boys, right? And why would I let you in to my setting? And these are kids who are often marginalized. And you're a teacher. I was all the labels that they challenged. But I came back, and for a full semester, I started to look up, what method would work best. And the ethnography, the little that I was exposed to at that time, felt like I think it would be a good match because it would allow me to collect data, qualitative data, right? Like observing their environment, their natural setting, and not really trying to alter, how they're reading and writing in that context. And so I could really understand it through their perspective. I could collect artifacts, and because they read and write both out of school but then online as well, it will give me the ability to collect data that way. And then more than interviews per se, it's the conversations that I get to have with them. And so I applied for grants and the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, so I could study, human subjects. And I went there in the summer with the intent to just make it into the community. And that's all I thought. It will probably take me all summer for them to let me in. And so I did, and it was surprising, but certain things started to emerge, as you're in that setting, I guess kind of thinking through your experience. I look young, so when I take off all the makeup and dress differently, if I'm with them, they kind of forget sometimes, oh, she's a researcher. I speak Tagalog, their native language, so when they're hanging out, I could, as they switch from one language to another, I could keep up with it. And that's how it started to emerge. And so through that process, I really learned a lot about, the key questions that I was asking as a teacher. And it helps me now, working and training, pre-service and in-service teachers in terms of how to work with these kids, how to understand their perspective, and I think one key moment that was like a breaking point and help us really start to work together. Whatever I write, I share it with them because these are real people, right? And because they're so public, you could search them online. And I'd asked like if they wanted to use pseudonyms. They already use pseudonyms, but they felt like no. The whole issue here is that people don't hear what we have to say. So if you give us pseudonyms, they're not going to know it's our message. So these are people that you could search online, and when I write about them, I use their pseudonyms that are searchable. So to me, it's really critical that, you know, ethically what I write aligns with their perceptions as well, and I'm really careful about how I write the data and the articles and whatnot. But I remember one time we were sitting together, and one of my sentences talked about them struggling in school. And they couldn't get past that, and finally one of my participants said, like, why do you use the word struggling? I said, well, he described, like, some of you have dropped out of school, some of you, you know, just don't do well in school, and they're like, did it ever occur to you that we're resisting? Like, why would you use that word right away? And that really changed my research to just look at it in terms of reading and writing in out of school context, but understanding that this has to do with kids' sense of identity, their sense of belonging. These are kids who are neither Filipino or British, but are trying to create a different space where they can belong. And so the hybridity of their identity and the hybridity of their reading and writing practices is far deeper than just succeeding academically, right? And so my research kept evolving like through that process, and even my data collection and my data analysis had to evolve. There were things I didn't study in books because I had to start doing a different kind of analysis to really demonstrate the complexity of how their reading and writing is transpiring. So with the explosion of technology, I had to account for not only like my transcriptions, for example, are not just based on their words, or their speech or their writing, but I also look at their performance, right? So their gestures, even like facial expressions, the music that they put in the background, like because they like hip hop. So when I analyzed their videos, so I had to come up with a different way of analyzing based on the data that I was collecting. And probably one interesting thing that emerged in terms of talking about ethnography, you know, you follow your participants across different spaces. And I thought that primarily I'd be following them like in school, out of school, hanging out with friends at the park. But it turns out like one of the primary ways I collected data was following their online communities. So when I first started this, I studied them for 3 years. So at that time, Facebook was like really exploding, and they had all those online games. And I don't know if you guys remember the game Farmville. I'll talk about this. And so essentially, you know, like you collect, you know, you make money based on like what kind of farm that you build and the crops, but you could also leave like messages like in other people's farms. And so sometimes when I couldn't reach them on the phone, I couldn't reach them like through email or whatever else, I started to leave like notes on the farm. And if they're playing, they would like respond to me right away. And so it became like really interesting, like, oh my gosh, like if I want to find them, I have to figure out which channel they're on, right? So the whole idea of ethnography really evolved. Like it was very different from what I was reading. So in the context of the world that we live in, I could take some of the methods that I've read about, but I've had to really adapt it because this context is just so different. And even the same thing with the phones, like in the UK or oftentimes in Europe, the mobile phones have the SIM cards. So you switch the SIM card depending on which network you have. And economically speaking, like if you're in the same network as someone else, you don't pay anything to text or call each other. But if you're in a different network, you do. So I realized if I want them to respond to me, I can't be in a different network because they have to pay. So I had like 6 different SIM cards, right? Like one for every participant. And then every time I got there, they would like say like, oh, this one's a better deal. So I had to keep buying SIM cards. And at one point I was carrying like 4 different cell phones because it became annoying to keep switching it. And when I had to meet them at different times. But then the issue of trust like started to emerge here too, because depending on how close they are to you, they have different numbers to reach them. So the people who are closest to them has every single number. So I knew that I was getting closer to them the more I had access to these different SIM cards. And the same thing with their online channels. Even though they might have one final product, and so thinking about reading and writing, even though there's one final video that they demonstrate as like, this is the finished product, there's different takes of it and different renditions and different so it's almost like writing different drafts, so composing different videos. And some are really funny, like stations on YouTube that's like about all the outtakes, but they're not going to show that to just anyone. So the more I got closer to them, the more channels and feeds I was allowed to have access to. So for every data that I analyze, like you see it through different perspectives and how it started and where it ended. And so in terms of my methods, I think, I would classify it as ethnographic research, but again, it had adapted like considerably based on the context in which I studied my participants.
That's really good. Isn't it fun? Okay, do you all have anything else that you want to add about? We can do questions. Maybe you could talk a little bit more, because I've mentioned this to a couple of people, but maybe you could just talk a little bit more about secondary analysis and like existing data, what it means, pre-existing data sets, and how do you know what to look for, what to find, stuff like that. Sure.
So most of my data has been, I have a large-scale intervention study now, but a lot of the data that I used was this, an ICHG study, and that's called secondary data analysis, because somebody else went out and collected the data, and then I basically, it's kind of nice, I got these nice clean data files that then I analyzed. But the disadvantage to that is that I wasn't able to design the study myself. So I was lucky enough in that the data set that I was using was very rich and had a lot of data, both observational, self-report, teacher report, parent report. So I was able to answer a lot of the questions I was interested in with this data set. But had it not been as rich as it was, it would have really limited me, because it's somebody else going in with questions of their own, and you're adapting. You have to adapt your questions somewhat to the data that exists. So that's definitely an issue with secondary data analysis. In that if you're taking data from somebody else's study, they're going to obviously have different things that they're interested in than what you are. So that's one issue with secondary data analysis. Although it's a nice place to start sometimes, especially if you don't have funding yet, right? So a big thing. Did you just get funding for some of the work that you did?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So to do such extensive work like Mir did, that's expensive, right? So you have to apply for funding. So if there's a data set that already exists that you can sort of start to mine while you're waiting for funding, sometimes that's a nice way to bridge sort of, when you're just starting on a project to when you actually have your own data.
Can you tell us about your intervention?
Well, this is an intervention that's also in applied psychology, so with a professor in applied psychology. So it's a temperament-based intervention, trying to adapt classroom management strategies to individualized students' temperaments. So we went in and collected data on that, but also just sort of environmental data that myself and another co-PI was interested in. So going in and observing student-teacher relationships, student-teacher interactions, collecting standardized assessments of achievement. So that's another sort of, you might be on an intervention study, let's say, that's looking at the impact of an intervention, but if it's a large-scale study, you can basically, what I like to do is quote-unquote control for the intervention effect, so try to figure out how much the intervention is contributing to children's achievement and control or take that out of the models, and then look at sort of natural context, like the student-teacher relationship, and how that impacts achievement. So all these different sort of ways you can look at the same question, right, in different data sets. But I'd be curious to see about your experience in terms of funding for, because that's a huge project.
Yeah. So I started small, like I asked for funding through Steinhardt, and then because to get larger funding, you have to be able to demonstrate like your ability to really carry out the project. So after the first trip, and I had to invest a little bit of my own, funds. What year you have as a graduate student. but after that, I had data, and I started to analyze it, and then from there I applied for the National Academy of Education Spencer pre-doctoral fellowship, and that gave me a more significant amount to be able to go back and collect even more data to extend my study. And because with ethnography, you have a basic focus that you're looking at, and you have a general question, but as you spend more time and based on the data that you collect, you can become more specific with the questions that you ask. And so I knew that after that first summer, it just wasn't enough time, and that I had to go back a few more times. So with the funding that I received, I was able to extend the study another 2 years, which helped tremendously in terms of really crafting the study from that point. But I think one thing that Erin was saying about looking at secondary data sources, as a junior researcher, it was really taxing and draining to do the ethnography. I loved it and I learned so much, but it's not something that I would recommend to somebody just starting out, because while I was taking classes, every break that I had, I was flying over there, because you have to maintain a relationship with your participants. I can't be gone for a whole year, right? So I was flying about 4 times every semester, anywhere from a weekend to 2 weeks. And then every summer I would be there. Christmas I would spend on my own, and New Year's, and so I could collect my data. So it really was I really had to devote my life for the 3 years that I was doing this work, and I felt like I needed to do that because I was dealing with participants who were already so sensitive to the idea of education and research, and so I felt like ethically it was the right thing to do, but it was so draining in every way possible, including economically. That was when the U.S. dollar was so low; it was almost 2-to-1 conversion. So I was walking everywhere because it was so expensive. So I think doing a study like that might be something worthwhile, the second stage or the third stage. But to start out, I wouldn't recommend it. Unless it's more controlled, if doing the ethnography, but maybe in a very controlled setting. Otherwise, it just gets so big.
I was just going to ask if you had planned that to happen, or it was just sort of turned into that when you... Do your cheeks gotta talk.
Okay, I'm not talking anymore.
Okay, alright, ignore it. Alright, I'm just gonna put it
So if you had planned for it to happen that way, or it was just something that just consumed your work as a doctor student?
I had to do it that way because my questions weren't answered yet, and I felt like if I stop it short, I'm not really answering my questions, right? So I knew I had to keep going until the data that I was collecting was starting to repeat itself, and it didn't start to do that until about 2 years. So the third year was really going back and checking in with them and doing follow-up, more focused interviews. So I had intended, I knew I wanted to do 2 years, and based on my study about this method, it seemed oftentimes when people do ethnography, it does take a long time, and some people, like Shirley Bryce Heath did it for 10 years in one community. So 3 seems really short compared to what people often do. So I've kept it open, and I do still work with them, and I go back and I still collect data because the questions I'm asking now are different. But it felt like I knew I had to do a serious time commitment picking this method.
Do you want to stay with the same community as you move forward, or are you thinking of
I think, I think that looking ahead, it would be helpful to study, other adolescents in other contexts. So it's more of an international study. So looking ahead, I don't just want to study them in the UK, but I want to study other youth, in other parts of the world. projecting that's their trajectory. But in the interim, a big part of this study was to inform teacher training. So I've spent the past 2 years really working hard to translate what I've learned to work with teachers and to help teachers craft pedagogy that really helps kids like the ones that I've studied. And I felt like before I can move forward, I needed to be able to speak to teachers about that. Otherwise, my research will just be for researchers. And so I've really spent a lot of time at NYU really focusing on the teaching and with companies like around New York translating this when they make new resources for schools and for students and teachers, and really just learning how to communicate and how to bridge, because the out of school literacy practices are very different from in school. So how do you start bridging that? So I'm not asking teachers to completely erase what they've been taught, but it's more about building on to what they do have currently. So it takes a lot of work. So the 2 years I've devoted to that, and so now I'm looking at the next stage of this research.
You brought up a good point about this whole who your audience is with research, right? I think with quantitative research, sometimes more than qualitative, although I think both. Sometimes there's the danger of, or not the danger, but we speak well to academics and in research journals, but thinking about the audience that you want to inform. So translating research work to work that can be implemented in a classroom or whatever environment sort of you're interested in studying. But sort of sometimes speaking to both audiences. And I think quantitative research sometimes more than qualitative gets lost in the sort of academic realm and not translated into, so teacher-child relationships matter, but then how do you can show it with fancy numbers, but then how do you actually talk to teachers about how you can improve relationships with students? And I think sometimes what your end product is informs sort of sometimes the research methods you use and the research questions that you ask, which I wasn't quite as aware of. I went in interested because I'd been in a classroom sort of and noticing all these different variations in quality, the relationships that I had with students and that the other teacher in the classroom had with students. And I wanted to go back and eventually get into sort of professional development. But sometimes the methods I was using, the data sets I was using, it was gearing me towards sort of journal venues that weren't read by teachers. They were read more by psychologists in academia, and sort of stepping back and trying to figure out then how to translate this into something that actually works in the classroom has been challenging at times. So it's who you want your audience to be sometimes drives the research questions that you ask and the methods that you use.
Yeah, and there are different types of journals. There are journals that are geared toward academics exclusively. There are some journals that are a little bit more of a bridging sort of practitioners and researchers will read this journal. And then there are some that look like magazines. Some of them are actually journals. They're peer-reviewed, which means that people who are not the researcher read the article, and the people don't know who wrote it, and the person who wrote it doesn't know who's reading it, and it's supposed to be a fair and balanced evaluation of the work, of the research and the quality of it for publication. That's peer review. So there are peer-reviewed journals that look like magazines that are intended specifically to attract practitioners. Like, oh, this looks like a very readable, interesting, and there are lots of ideas for things to do in the classroom. At the same time, there are articles that say this is what the research shows. So there are, in education, we're lucky to have that range of types of materials. But for researchers themselves, I think one of the things that we're hearing is that researchers themselves do have to make those decisions. They do have choices to make about who they're trying to address and how they're going to frame their message based on who they're addressing. There's another audience too, is policymakers that pay attention to research, and how does the chancellor of New York City schools make a decision about a curriculum that's going to be applied for all middle schoolers, say in the city? That's a huge decision, and it's a policy-making decision that the researchers are going to have, one set of sort of priorities. The practitioners might have a different set of priorities, and then the policymaker is like, okay, I hear what you're saying about, this research and these variables and all this stuff, and I hear what you're saying about like your individual classroom, but I have to think about hundreds of classrooms, and I have to think about not being able to control all the variables that are possible in this model. So it's important to be able to, as much as possible, speak different languages in a sense as a researcher, so that you can make your work a little bit more flexible, or you can, and another thing that's completely fair to do is to say, I realize that for a policy this would be a really complicated way to apply it. That doesn't mean I don't want you to think about it, or for practitioners, yes, I understand that it may not be so easy to do this in a classroom, but that doesn't mean that this is a bad idea, right? Now I've given you an idea. You can figure out how to implement it. I'm not saying you have to implement it specifically in this way, but what I'm saying is there's this underlying principle that's important. So that's kind of the work that we do as professionals, as professional researchers, is trying to figure out, like, how do we speak to different audiences? And some people even do stuff like op-eds or publish in Huffington Post. They, so that they can reach an even broader audience. So there are lots of different venues for spreading the news about, your work. Any other questions?
I have sort of a question that relates like accessibility to research. Is there any particular reason, what I've been noticing is when I read a lot of the research is that it's in language that's very convoluted and not very clear, not very accessible. And I was wondering if if there's some sort of purpose to that I can't see. I don't understand why research articles or articles in research journals have to be so
boring.
Written.
You can say it.
I just don't understand why they.
We've never written a boring article, so you can totally say that.
Yeah, I just don't get it. It just seems sort of silly to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are clearer ways to get certain points across. I just feel like the language is bogged down really unnecessarily, and I was wondering if there's a reason for that, or I'm right and there's no reason. So I don't know.
Well, part of it is it's a long part. You read something like a journal. Every journal article that you're given, for the most part, if it's from a peer-reviewed journal, that takes minimum 2 years, right?
Crazy.
And so there are multiple drafts that are written, and not to mention the drafts you didn't even submit that other people edited. So even though the core ideas are yours, you have a whole team giving feedback. So, oftentimes when we write for a semester, you get feedback from your professor, and you don't necessarily have to revise again. But when we have to write it, there are certain criteria, even down to the format that it has to have, the subcategories, the font, the margins. All of that is dictated by the journal. So we can put our content in there, but sometimes there really isn't much room to be super creative with the language because there's a word limit. So you need to get the point across. So I think in one way, that's what constrains a little bit with the ability to write something that might be more entertaining. When you read books, though, there's more room, right? And the kind of rigor that goes into writing a book, and the amount of people touching that and giving feedback is less. So books, you have more room to do it. But journal articles, you just don't, depending on which one it is.
I know we talked about this briefly in our class, right?
Yeah.
No pictures in color, all these weird rules that journal articles have.
It's changing a little bit though, and I found with the work that I do, because it's multimodal data, so even color I analyze, right? And so in the UK especially, they even certain schools allow half of the dissertation to be multimodal and not everything to be the traditional writing. And so they also have journals, publications that are online and you can read in your e-reader, and that will allow for color in ways that will be cheaper to print than if it's just the journal articles itself. So it's changing, it's taking time, but it's evolving.
Also with quantitative, so in theory, your data should be public, right? So if somebody requests, it can be audited. If somebody requests your data, they should be able to have your data, especially if it has to be if it's funded by a federal grant, which most large-scale research projects are. And the idea is that somebody should be able to read the article and replicate that data and get the same findings you did. So you have to be painstakingly detailed so that they could go and do that in theory without you. Because there are these meta-analyses, they're called, right, where they take a bunch of different studies that all look at the same topic with different data sets, and they try to reanalyze the data and find sort of this effect. What's the general effect for, let's say, student-teacher relationships? So look at 30 different research articles, they use 30 different data sets. They request those 30 different data sets, and then they'll try to sort of analyze that data as a whole. So the idea is that you can replicate it, so it has to be extremely detailed what variables you use, how you recoded variables, all that kind of stuff for really any, I think, data set, but I'm just saying quantitative because that's what I do. But so the idea that it's very transparent to just a researcher in the same field. And then I think too, also people feel that they want to couch, right? So you don't want to be like the authority speaker on something. You have to provide all the different caveats, right? So like in the discussion section, there's a lot of, somewhat, it could be this, it could be that. Sometimes it makes it very boring, for lack of a better word.
We talked about last week how journal articles have, was it last week or the week before? Last week, the journal articles have a particular, like a standard structure, and that's just one of the ways to think about like why articles are the way that they are, is that academic writing is a genre of writing, just like poetry is a genre, just like writing expository essay is a genre. Academic writing is a genre. So it's just sort of like it has sort of like a canon or a set of expectations of how it's supposed to be presented. Now, like Mir said, things are changing in academic publishing, and people are more interested in kind of personalizing, or at least livening, deepening, making things more rich and descriptive, but those things take space. And I was talking to a journal editor recently who admitted to me that in her journal they are very hesitant to publish ethnographies because it's too many words. They just don't have the space for it. Publishing is expensive, paper's expensive, ink is expensive, and producing all that stuff is expensive. So they're hesitant to give people, because and the thing is that because you want to make your research replicable, you do have to be super precise as to what you did. But if what you did was what Mir did, imagine the number of words it's going to take her to describe what she did in such a way that I can just go to England and do the same thing, say with a group of, I don't know, Pakistani kids. Like if I wanted to say, okay, I'm going to replicate her study but do it with Pakistani kids, I'm going to need to know a lot of information from her article that it's going to take a lot of space for her to describe, more so than, say, Erin, who said, well, I used the NICHD data sets, here are my variables that I pulled, and then here's what I found. That's part of it too. How about from that side of the room? Anybody have any questions based on what you think that you're going to do or what you're planning on doing for your thesis? Those people who are more solidified, that Mir and Erin can give you some advice about?
I have a question. Our reading this week touched a little bit about mixed methods and how it wasn't just, I know you do quantitative research, so I was just wondering if you found that it was not just quantitative, but you also had a little bit of qualitative methods as well, and for you, quantitative. Well, you worked a lot with numbers, I guess, but, interviews, but also did you have to produce, like, hard statistics and numbers and... Good question.
Well, for me, I've pretty much stuck with quantitative just because that's where my training lies. But I would like to at some point pair with a qualitative researcher to sort of look at these issues in more, especially the data set that I'm working with now with intervention, where I actually know the families, know the children, to collect data, actually looking at sort of qualitative data often can get at sort of like the mechanisms through which things happen more than quantitative data. So, interviewing students as to why the relationship matters and trying to figure it out from sort of those interviews how that impacts achievement. But I haven't done that yet, partly because my training was so focused on quantitative that I don't necessarily feel comfortable doing qualitative analyses. I would definitely want to pair with a qualitative researcher. I just don't have that opportunity yet. But it's definitely something I want to do because it does get at very different information than just pure quantitative.
I'm in a similar situation. So I talked about how I want the study to grow and looking at it like on a more international scale. But before I can do that, like I need to be comfortable with using other more quantitative methods besides just the qualitative. And so my approach, I'm going to be doing work with colleagues that deal with, well, there's 2 projects, but essentially the 2 projects that I'll be working on, you know, the common ground is that we all analyze multimodally, but some people are more quantitative researchers. So I feel like, you know, after you're done studying, you're never finished studying because you always have to learn. Like to be able to do good, solid research that can be replicated, that has rigor, it's important that you're not just haphazardly throwing methods together. It needs to fit the question that you're asking. So I know before I could move to my next phase, I have to go through another set of training in terms of understanding methods that are mixed, right? Because once you look at something on a larger scale, the ethnography is just not going to be enough. So probably for the next year or 2, I'll be working on like really tightening my methods beyond just ethnography and looking at more quantitative ways of analyzing data, and at the same time designing the next phase of my study so that I could look at it on a larger scale, but also because I need to be able to speak to a larger audience, and it's hard to talk to policymakers while I'm using this ethnographic data. And so working with these colleagues, this is something that they do on a regular basis, and it's something that they implement well when they design their studies. They're already looking at the different audiences, the different journal articles, the different grants that they're writing to. So I feel like that training is significant for me to carry out the next phase of my work and for it to like really have a chance at having a broader audience. So I guess it's interesting, but like when I think of like short-term and long-term goals, when I do research, I know what I want to do, but I know it takes time to do it. So the steps that I take in between really work towards the long-term goal, but in the immediate, sometimes I'm okay with letting go of my immediate questions so that I could get the training that I need so I could do that and answer it better, if that makes sense.
This might be kind of broad, but like, do you have any suggestions on how to zero in on your central question?
That's really good.
I know it's a big question. Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes there's like the pragmatist in me that says, you know, you have to figure out sort of your resources too, right? So the training that you have, right? So the sort of the methods the methods that you're comfortable with often somewhat determine the kind of data that you can analyze, which then determines the kind of question you can ask. So if I'm only comfortable with quantitative research, I can really only ask 2 things if things relate to one another. I can't really get at the mechanisms for why they relate. So my questions tend to be questions that are correlation questions. So it's sort of the methods driving the question a bit, but and then really trying to, I think, tease apart what you think you can confidently look at. So if you're looking at the achievement gap is not something that you can do in a semester. So trying to figure out sort of practically speaking, how big your question is. They're often really small, right? So people tend to start out with really, and all researchers do this, really, really big questions, right? But then you narrow it down based on the population that you have, based on the methods that you have, sometimes to analyzing one student and their experience in the classroom. I don't know if that really answers your question. And I'm sorry, I apologize, I have to leave soon. I have a live meeting, it's always at 3, and I tried to change it, but all the players involved couldn't do that, so.
I did it. I think knowing how your brain works, how your mind works, is a key part. You don't want to pick a method or ask a question that that's so like at a different ballpark from the way you conceptualize things when you start. So for example, one thing that I knew, like, my thinking is just, it's not linear, right? I tend to jump around and ask a million questions. So one thing that I did to help myself narrow down my ideas, I designed a website. That sounds really funny, but like I did just like on the Mac, I can't remember, is it iWeb, I think? Because then I didn't have to make it public, I could make it private. But I had one page devoted just to my question. And every day, as I would take the train back from taking my classes here at NYU when I was doing my doctoral studies, I would keep working on my question. I would keep re-asking it and working on my sentence, because it's a different question when you start with how versus what. And so I started to like really look closely at how I asked my questions, and I started to really look at that, and I would just sit there and like, why did you ask that? What kind of data do you need to be able to answer that? So I would just sit there and play with it, and it feels silly like for an hour to be doing that, but you know, it helped me tremendously, because I understood the value of words, and so I just kept playing around, and I would have different questions, and then based on the question that I would ask, like when you design the website, like articles that relate to that question, I could drop it in there. So I was starting to create annotated bibliographies to go with my question. So I designed a website, and somehow like it started to help me think and map out what I need to do. So that helped a lot.
It also helps, I think, I mean, that's a wonderful idea. Bouncing it off friends, right? Colleagues, friends. Something that makes seem really clear to you, and the answer will be you know, you bounce it off somebody, and they'll come back with 1,000 different, you know, sort of critiques. So I think a community like you have here is really helpful. And it, you know, the different iterations of your question. So I apologize, I have to run.
It's all right. Thank you.
My email is eoc2@nyu.edu if you have any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Fascinated by your research. I'm like, tell me more. Give me a phone. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, no problem. Anyone else have any questions? Or want some advice? Or okay, well, thank you so much, Mir. It was really good having you. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay, so then we can turn to discussing our reading. Did anybody have a chance to skim the Creswell article, Creswell chapter on research questions and hypotheses? Everybody had a chance to just take a look at it at least, if not read it thoroughly? Okay. So... can you see me? No. Okay. Okay, yeah. Oh. Okay, yeah. All right, thanks.
Did this get edited, or?
Oh no! I mean, it's like it's two other students
I know, yeah.
who are in our programs. It's not,
It's
you
just
know,
funny.
it's
No,
nothing.
no, I know, it's
right?
just funny.
Yeah. No. And so, all right. I'm not going to even try to do skinny arms. I can't. I couldn't possibly. I would have to just cut myself in half. So, looking at the mixed methods research, I think, you know, a lot of the points that they made about training is some of the stuff that this article was about. It's like a lot of the reason why most people don't do mixed methods research is because our training is so focused on a particular method and a particular approach. And it's so much work learning another method or approach that it's like, so even just thinking about like professional trajectories. Erin, up until this year, like just, or last year I guess technically, she didn't have tenure. She just got tenure, which is really awesome and wonderful and amazing. to get tenure, you have to publish a lot. You have to publish a ton of articles. If you're trying to publish a ton of articles, you don't have time to train for 1 or 2 years in a new method because it's interesting or because you would like to learn something new and different. That's something that people will do later on in their careers. Like she's like, now that she's post-tenure doing this intervention study, now she's like, oh, it would be cool to pair with a qualitative researcher and learn some, how to look at these questions. And then she might, once she gets started with that, might decide that, oh, I actually want to learn a little bit more about that. But it takes a really long time. And I'll give you a personal example. I was I was proposing this study of parent involvement in Head Start. So I study parent involvement, and I had this Head Start that I wanted to do my research in. But one of the things that I really wanted to do was discourse analysis. And discourse analysis is something that linguists use to look at, to really think about like what people say, what discourse, words as well as text, but just analyzing text. And words are text, but so analyzing like what people say, what people write, what kind of posters are around and whatever, to see what kinds of messages are being communicated and what are some of the sort of themes about how certain things are understood or talked about in a particular setting. Well, that is a highly specialized form of qualitative research and qualitative analysis. And so I went in thinking like, I'm just going to do a little discourse analysis. And then I hired with some grant money, hired a colleague of mine, hired to be my consultant. When he assigned me readings and we sat down and started talking about it, I literally started crying because I was like, I feel like you're speaking in a completely different language, and I'm freaking out because I'm realizing that I can't do this. Like, I don't have time. I need to collect these data like next week. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea what this is all about. So it really is very serious. And Mir she's really fortunate because she is in a time in her career where she still has time to do a little bit more training. So she has an opportunity to continue that sort of exploratory phase before she launches into like, okay, this is it. This is what I'm going to be doing kind of for the rest of my life in a sense. But it really does require, these are such highly specialized techniques that it's not just something that you learn overnight. And you don't want to do kind of like a crap job. Like, oh yeah, I'm just going to throw in an interview. If you don't know what you're doing, that's going to be a crappy interview and it's not going to be useful to anybody. Or, oh, I'm just going to throw in a survey. Well, I'm going to create a survey. Do you know about survey design? Do you know how to ask, like how questions should be phrased? Do you know about scales and measurement? There's so much knowledge that goes into all of it that that's one of the reasons. I think they're arguing that doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be that way, and it doesn't have to limit people, and then we should be training students more to think across methodologies and to think like that there are questions that we can answer, that we can benefit from both approaches. But it's also important to recognize that like there's a very defensible reason why it's been the way that it's been. It doesn't mean it has to stay that way, but it's complicated. Anybody have any questions specifically related to this article on mixed methods research? Or is anybody thinking about doing a mixed methods design? I think Talia might be, but she's not here. So who knows, based on the kinds of questions that they're asking, who already thinks that they have a pretty good sense of what methods they're going to use, quantitative or qualitative? Go ahead.
Oh, I think, I was talking with Michael, and I think he's saying that I should probably go with qualitative. With quantitative, because we're going to be comparing reading ability versus how often students read and the correlation between that. So I think that's what we're going with that. And he already gave me like a data set to look at for that. So yeah, great.
I'm probably going to be doing a qualitative study just because I'm literally looking at the quality of pre-referral processes and the parents like being informed. So like my survey is probably going to ask more responsive questions.
I Are you gonna be like
You-
actually doing this? Like,
You're gonna do an interview, or are you gonna do a survey?
Well, I'm working with this woman who works in a special ed, like parent. It's called Parent to Parent, where she works with parents of students in special ed, and like, because they're not always informed of their rights, la da da. And so, I spoke with her, and she says she can put something that I create up on a listserv, and so I'm thinking I have to like narrow down exactly what kind of parents I want to answer my survey, but I'm thinking of creating a survey looking into like what parents, how parents have been informed during the pre-referral process. Yeah, and like how much RTI has really been done.
And are you going to be, so in your survey, are you going to be asking open-ended questions or closed-ended questions?
I'm not quite sure about what I'm gonna be. I mean, some will be closed-ended, like, you know, like when was your child like referred to special ed? But then some of them I'm like curious about like what, like how did your teacher
Tell you
tell
about
you
or
about
whatever.
it? Were you informed about it?
Mhm.
Or something. I don't know. So maybe more closed-ended. I'm not sure.
Well, so qualitative research is where you would be asking a lot of open-ended questions and asking questions that you can then sort of analyze the more of the processes or more of like the experience. But if you if say you were to do a survey and it was like, how much do you agree or disagree? You know, that I was informed, agree,
Yeah.
disagree. That's actually a quantitative study.
Yeah.
You know, I was given the right information. I feel like I was, you know, blah blah blah. Like if you're asking survey questions with a scale, that's quantitative.
I guess I'm not really sure yet. I want to do the agree or disagree.
Yeah. That's going to depend on. It's actually going to depend on your question. It's going to take you back to. So you know that you're going to be doing a survey and that you're going to be able to post it to this listserv, but then based on the actual question, and this is where reading Cresswell is going to really help, like based on what question you're hoping to answer at the end of the day, then you're going to go back and say, okay, then I really do just want to scale, because what I'm asking is like, what is the relationship between,
Yeah.
or you know, like that, like Mira was saying, language matters. So if you're asking like about relationship or causality, or even if you, because we all know that we're not going to establish any causality, you know, in a semester, but if you're leaning in that direction, we're going to cut you back and say you're not going to ask about causality, you're going to ask about relationship. But that is a quantitative question versus a, what is it like? What do people feel about?
Yeah.
How have they experienced? You know.
Would you
So it'll take it.
would you say that it's easier to do qualitative just because it's more like, not qualitative, quantitative? I keep confusing them, but would you say that it's easier to do that because it's more cut and dry, like in terms of numbers and stuff like that? Whereas with qualitative, you're dealing with how people feel about things, and everything is really open ended. It's easier to make judgments.
Well, I mean, quantitative, it's all complicated because in quantitative you have to know the right statistical techniques to apply to analyze the data. That's not, you can't just like, you know, go to the 7-Eleven and like pick up a packet on like how to do that. So it's really difficult to know, okay, so now I have my data. Now what? Now how do I ask the program, right? SPSS or SAS, which are quantitative analysis programs. How do I tell the program what to do so that it can give me the answers that are going to lead me to answer my question? That's really complicated. So I wouldn't say it's easier. And also, I mean, if you're designing your own survey, then that's also like a really complicated process, because you have to, if you're designing a quantitative survey, what kind of scale you use, whether it's a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale, that matters in terms of like statistically and what you're going to find, and it matters how you phrase the questions, and you have to be really careful about a lot of things. So I think it's all, you know, all pretty tough.
Yeah.
A lot of people usually ask the reverse question. A lot of people usually ask if qualitative research is easier, because they're like, well, you're just talking to people, you know, isn't that pretty easy? And the answer is no, because again, not only is it complicated to sort of set up the right conditions and figure out exactly how you're going to do it. Like Mir talked about what is she's worrying about trust, she's worrying about ethics in a different kind of way. Of course, everybody's worried about ethics, but do you know what I mean? Like now she's engaging in a relationship with people, so there are a whole different set of things that she has to think about, and that's on the front end. And then to analyze, she had to come up with her own methods because nothing that exists was really adequate. So we might use methods like reading and rereading, and looking for themes, like things that sort of repeat themselves. But then you have to make sure that what you're finding is something that another person would find, and it's not just you in your own little world, coming up with your own, like drawing your own conclusions. So. So any questions or comments about this article? Okay, so even though we only skimmed the Creswell, and so we can come back to it, in the future, we'll keep referring to it, especially as I'm helping people refine their questions, but anything specific that anybody wanted to sort of clarify or touch on from what they skimmed?
This idea of central questions with subsequent questions,
Yeah.
right? So I was just wondering if that was applicable to us. I mean, I know as we're narrowing down our research, like, my question was a little bit too vague, and I have to kind of zone in on more, like, narrow in on a question. But I was just wondering what a subsequent question would be, and like how we were to come up to 5 or 6.
Well, you don't have to ask subsequent
Right.
questions, but sometimes your first question or your central question is really not detailed enough to get at what it is that you want to know. So then you would just ask sub questions. It's almost like if you were asking someone, like, can you tell me how you like, or can you tell me about the game that you just watched? And the person says, and then you say, well, what parts of it did you enjoy? Okay, and what parts of it did you not enjoy? So it's really just kind of refining. Like you start with a broad question, and then you specify. So not all questions will need that level of specification, but many of them do. Usually central questions are not standalone, but sometimes they really are, genuinely. Like it's okay. One thing I can do is I can post just questions that I've asked, research questions that I've posed through my research, and just kind of like create a little sheet that just puts them all together, and then you all can see, sort of. And then sometimes I have, in some of the work that I do, I have questions that are not research questions or sub-questions, but they're just questions. They're questions that I want the reader to think about. And so when I'm writing an article, I may ask, like, what does this mean for education? How can we think differently about this? And that's not a research question, but it's a question that's getting sort of like, I'm going to get to what I'm saying in some ways by asking these questions is sort of like, I'm going to propose one way that we might answer this question about, like, what does this mean for education? That's such a huge question. There's no way we could answer that. But I'm saying one of the ways that I think, we could think about education differently is if, based on my findings, blah, blah, blah. So I'll put that together. Okay, the sentence outlines, I also have a handout for that. So that's the next thing that's due. It's not due until the 23rd of October.